Welcome to WEFTEC Now. I'm Travis Loop with the Water Environment Federation. Very excited to have Kathy Schubert here. She is Senior Product Manager at NASA Glenn Research Center. Kathy, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Great. We're doing a whole series of these video interviews at WEFTEC, but this is probably the one I'm most excited for, just personally, because I'm fascinated by space and fascinated by water in space.
Okay.
So I'm looking forward to this. But first, could you describe your work at NASA Glenn Research Center?
Sure. So NASA Glenn Research Center, we're located in Cleveland, Ohio, and we are one of 10 NASA centers that are distributed across the United States. Each reporting to NASA headquarters that's located in Washington, D.C. And so we all have key roles and activities and testing that we support from the center, depending upon our areas of expertise. So up at NASA Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, we have a very diverse portfolio of spaceflight projects, supporting satellite development, planetary research, but also quite a few activities supporting the human exploration and the development of the Orion spacecraft. We have a major component that's part of the Space Launch System, and then most recently is the development of the power and propulsion element. And that's a really critical first element that will be part of the future gateway architecture.
Wow, so many exciting things, so many things I could follow up on there and ask about. But let's pivot a bit to why water is important to space travel and exploration. Obviously, humans need water to survive, but
Yes.
Could you talk about it a little bit?
Sure. So when you think about water and the human consumption of water, predominantly, you have to look at how do you transfer or ferry it into space. And taking that route is very expensive. And so to launch a liter of water into low Earth orbit is almost $1,500 per kilogram. And so you or me, we may consume anywhere from 3 to 4 or 5 liters a day. And so it adds up really quickly.
Sure.
And when you start thinking about extending the ability for humans to explore beyond low Earth orbit and beyond the International Space Station, then it even becomes more critical that we have a way of recycling any source of water, as well as discovering water on distant planets, whether that be the moon or Mars or planets out there that we want to hopefully go to someday.
It's exciting stuff. So one of the big challenges with managing water in space is the weight of water, right? That it's pretty heavy, and you, like you said, you need a lot of it to sustain humans. What are some of the other challenges with managing water?
So when we have to manage water in space, so we have systems that also consume water in addition to humans.
Okay.
And so think about how a fluid behaves in the absence of gravity. And so water is going to float. And so the basic fluid physics that we're so used to because we've operated here on Earth and we understand how they're going to behave in gravity behave very differently in space. And so in addition to water floating, it would contain bubbles. And here you think of, you open up a can of Coca-Cola and the bubbles are going to rise to the surface of the fluid. When we're in space, those bubbles, they are suspended in that fluid. And so normally we have ways of extracting bubbles from fluid. In space, we have to maybe ingest those bubbles. And we have to build capabilities that recognize and aren't, that their performance doesn't suffer because there's bubbles floating in the fluid in space.
What kind of systems then require water? It's to cool some equipment or computers, or how does?
Well, so the primary one on the International Space Station, we use water to generate oxygen. And so that's the source of the breathable oxygen that the crew use on board the space station. And so you want to take that water and you want to break it down into its 2 basic components of hydrogen and oxygen. And then you've got a source for oxygen that, again, you didn't have to ferry with you. And you're able to vent the hydrogen from the spacecraft.
Okay.
Eventually, whenever we reach the point where we're back on the surface of the moon, which we hope to return to the moon by 2024, ideally, you find a water source on the surface of the planet of the moon that you can then take and use, and now you've got a capability that can give you oxygen that you need to sustain life, but you also have a fuel source, and that fuel source becomes really critical.
The hydrogen.
Right,
yeah.
In the form of hydrogen to supporting exploration beyond the moon.
Wow. Are other challenges with managing water in space? Is that primary? It's the weight, the traveling, and then
sure, the weight and the mass and the storage. Certainly, all your potable sources of water, you want to make sure that they're appropriately disinfected and all of that sort of thing.
And then the way that just the laws of physics are different. Well, not the laws of physics, but the gravity and so forth is different in space than you have on Earth. Yeah.
Yes.
Sure. I want to dive into how water is managed on the International Space Station.
Okay.
I've been to a museum, and it has a thing that says today's coffee is tomorrow's coffee, right?
Yes.
So that's all about water reuse. But yeah, could you talk a bit about how water is managed? What's the system?
Sure. So the system on board the International Space Station, it's based on technology that was first developed for the Saboteur system, and essentially that collects all the sources of water, whether it's the water that is expelled by humans in the form of urine or sweat or evaporation, as well as any remaining water not consumed by the other space station systems. And so it takes all of that water through the system to generate a new potable, usable water source.
Okay. How does it treat the water? How does it clean it?
So it uses heat to clean it, and it also is treated with iodine at the very end. So so think heat, filtration, and then iodine to ensure that it is appropriately and effectively disinfected.
I heard about this, capturing the water that's evaporated, or how does that done? How is the obviously there's ways to capture the other water, but how does it capture the water that's out of the air, if you will?
Well, so they're going to first collect the air, pull the air in. They're circulating air through the whole closed loop system, and then it's run over a chemical that will extract the fluids from that, and then that fluid is then added to the containment system of all of the water sources, whether it's coming from hygiene, human sources, or from any of those other sources coming out of the air. So essentially you're extracting the humidity out of the air, much like you would on Earth. So,
water from air.
Right. Yeah. Small sources, but some.
Some, sure. Every bit counts. Every drop counts, right?
Yes.
Do they have to take water up every time there's a trip to the space station? Is bringing some new water part of that every time, or how much do they actually are they able to reuse, and how's that all work out?
Yes, so they do ferry water. So when we have cargo launches to the International Space Station, they take containers of water, and then those are then supplemental to what they're able to recycle and reuse on board the space station. Okay. And so the urine, producing water from urine is about 85% effective.
Okay, so you're going to lose some out of that process.
Right, there's going to be some losses. And so yes, they do have to have some resupply capability. The nice part is that you are never 100% dependent on that resupply. And so, they run their calculations to make sure that there's plenty of margin in supporting the humans as well as the station, the station systems and science payloads. And so think about some of the science payloads that are operating on board the International Space Station. They also consume some water. And so while it's not 100% effective closed loop system, you still have the ability to supplement it and ferry water to the International Space Station with each and every cargo launch.
I'm wondering about how much NASA has taught the world on the ground of Earth about water reuse technology and approaches versus how much maybe NASA is learning now, especially from some of the water reuse technology that's being developed on the ground?
Sure. Well, there's always a synergistic relationship, and in terms of developing the technology and maturing that technology to the point where it can be used or applied, whether that's here on Earth or in space, in space. And so there's a technology transfer program, so that as NASA develops new technologies that might benefit industries such as the water industry, they have access to those technologies through various licensing agreements. And so that's one way that we want to make sure we connect with the industries, so that they both have the information that they can gain access to, they can apply it commercially, and ideally they can then also develop those technologies to feed back into NASA. NASA has taken a lot of interest in developing commercial partnerships, and a lot of those commercial partnerships are based on that synergistic relationship and shared risk, shared benefit.
Sure. You mentioned about kind of discovering other sources of water, potentially on the moon or on Mars or other places. So what's that search like? What's being done to, kind of look for potential sources of water on these other places? And where is there real potential for it to be discovered?
Sure. So we've been sending satellites, and we have actually, sent satellites out to every planet in the solar system over the past 50 years or so. And so in terms of the surface of the moon, there's been a variety of activities looking specifically at the moon. The interest and what has scientists really excited about is the potential for large quantities of water below the north and the south pole of the moon. Okay. And when we talk large quantities, here we're used to seeing large quantities in the form of a lake, right, where they're visible. When you go to the moon, they're under the surface, and they're in the form of water ice. But our chief scientist, he talks about potential of 10 to 20,000 pounds of ice water or water ice under the North and the South Pole. And so that's certainly going to be an area of interest that we want to explore more, and then figure out how you can drill down to access that resource on the moon.
Sure.
So rovers, we've sent rovers out to other planets, and most people are very familiar with the Mars rover.
Oh yeah, those are celebrities in their own right, yeah.
Right, and so they're sending back a lot of science data giving some indication that there's sources of water on Mars. And so that's very exciting to researchers to be taking a look at that data. And
same kind of thing in the form of ice, subsurface?
Subsurface. There's some atmosphere on Mars, so it's, it is a very different environment from the moon. And, their challenge will be identifying larger quantities. And so right now, a lot of the discoveries seem to be sort of, pinpoint discoveries based on the analysis of the regolith and based on the analysis of what they're able to sample on the surface of Mars. Ideally, and there's an upcoming mission that will start returning samples from the surface of Mars back to Earth.
Wow.
And that has not occurred yet. And so while we have hundreds of samples that have come back from the moon, from the Apollo missions that visited the moon, we have not yet brought any samples back from Mars. Okay. And so that will really give us a lot more insight and knowledge as to what may exist on the surface of Mars.
Very interesting. I'm curious if there's any other signs of water out there with any of the other exploration that's happened. I just read an article recently about plans to send a drone to the moon Titan and for that to fly around and take a look and see things. So any other leads out there about water? Yeah,
so just last week there was a article that based on the analysis of data that was returned from the Hubble telescope, that they identified an exoplanet in the Leo constellation. And so that's looking beyond our atmosphere into a whole new constellation. And they think that they found evidence that there's a water signature and somewhat of an atmosphere in that planet.
Wow.
And so that is really very, very exciting that they're able to take a look at that data and those pictures, and so that will certainly become a target of interest as we continue developing our capabilities to explore further and go beyond our, our particular constellation to those places.
Sure. And what does it mean? What does it signify if there's water on these, on other planets or on the moon or in other galaxies? I mean, what does that mean, I guess, from a scientific standpoint? And this idea that water is life. Is water necessary for there to be life? Can there be life without water? These are some very big, heavy questions, but I'm very curious.
Yes. So, so what does the meaning of the discovery of water? First and foremost, it gives us the ability to sustain life in some form, as well as generate and use it as a potential fuel source. Mm-hmm. And so I talked about breaking it down into its basic elements, mm-hmm. and then being able to use that hydrogen as a potential fuel source. And so, so think of it as not only absolutely critical to human existence, but also critical and elemental to being able to mix with other substances to take that next step, to form those simple things that we take for granted here on Earth, so that we're in a position then to build upon that capability and then go further. And so right now our ability to travel with the Orion spacecraft, it will give us the ability to travel to the moon on the Space Launch System, which is NASA's next newest, biggest rocket. However, beyond that, we need a new vehicle with the capability to take us to Mars. And so, so the moon becomes a platform to aggregate enough capability so that you can then take that next step and go further. Yeah. And part of that is figuring out where you have resources that are in place on the surface of the moon. And that's why people are so excited that there's large quantities of water in the North and the South Pole. So.
Yeah, and just one other thing, I guess recently learned or remembered that comets are made of water and ice.
So sure, they're made probably of a lot of things.
All right.
And so think about where comets might originate and the distances that they travel. And so there's a fairly high likelihood that they would have some form of water ice. They're a little trickier if you want to send a probe to them. They're moving and landing a probe on a comet or a particular comet would be particularly challenging. But
I'm sure NASA's going to figure that out one day, though.
Yeah. Well, so one of the missions we're looking at developing or is in development it's actually APL, Applied Physics Lab. They're leading this. It's the DART mission, and they are looking at how to send a spacecraft to a small asteroid and whether or not they have the ability to slightly redirect its trajectory, slightly redirect its path. And that takes a lot of very high precision guidance, navigation, and control to get it there and then to actually alter its path. So.
Sure. Unbelievable. Well, I have 1,000 more questions, but I'll let you go for now. I really appreciate you coming by to talk about water and space, and I learned a lot. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Travis. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you all for watching. For more interviews, please visit weftec.org/now.